Hello from Canada. My name is Jude Fleming, and I am a long-time Wikileaks supporter, researcher, and writer. And today is kind of an emergency video blog, to bring people up to date that there's pretty much a murder happening in Britain under the guise of the rule of law. And I'm hoping that after people watch this video, they will be more motivated to fight for Julian Assange to be put on bail, released from prison on bail with constrictions and electronic tagging, with his kids and his soon-to-be wife, Stella Morris, and his father, in a place in Britain. He has no desire to leave Britain. He wants to be with his family, and he does want to see this through. So what's happening right now would fall under British law called corporate manslaughter, which includes death in custody due to gross negligence. So right now, Julian is a sitting duck trapped in Belmarsh. Britain sort of raised the hopes of many prisoners by talking about how it's going to be releasing some prisoners from custody to reduce the spread of COVID in prisons. But the two possible bases for doing that, the Ministry of Justice is excluding Assange from that. So the Ministry of Justice confirmed with another news organization, the AAP, that Assange, who is being held on remand, that's no conviction, he's already served a bail sentence, which was maximum bail sentence, he will not be temporarily released because he's not serving a custodial sentence and therefore not eligible under the Ministry of Justice guidelines that said that they would be releasing some prisoners who have a short remainder of their custodial sentence. So he's not eligible on that basis. Well, what about the fact that he's on remand? He's innocent until proven guilty. No such luck for Mr. Assange or his family or his kids, because the government is also working to expedite sentencing hearings for those on remand to reduce crowding in jails. But the Australian, Julian Assange, won't be affected by that measure either. Now, why would that be? Because he's not going to be sentenced for a crime. He hasn't been convicted of a crime in Britain. He's been indicted for extradition. So the answer, the next session of his U.S. extradition hearing is going to be in May, and then that might spill over into June and July. But the bottom line is it's either going to wind up being, yes, he's fit to be extradited to the U.S., and Britain agrees with this extradition, or it doesn't. It's going to be a yes-no. There's not going to be a sentence for a crime, because he has to first be convicted of a crime in the U.S. and then sentenced. So, circular logic, weird, illogical way, Julian is not even eligible, even though he's not convicted. He did abide by his bail conditions for something like 2,000 days or something like that. He followed all the bail expectations up until June the 19th, when it was very clear to him that his life was in danger. So the translation is that under no circumstances will Julian Assange be released, even temporarily, with an electronic manacle to prevent his foreseeable and probable death in custody. Caitlin Johnston said in a tweet on April the 4th, to minimize infection, the UK is granting early release to all non-violent, non-Julian Assange prisoners. And that kind of sums up the prejudice. And it's pretty apparent that Britain would rather that, and possibly the US, would rather that Assange die in custody in Britain than ever get out. And even if he did get out, as Chris Hedges said over the weekend, there's a high likelihood that he'd die of COVID in the US. So let's take a look at British laws. In UK law, where there's evidence of gross negligence in a prison's duty of care, that prison, the prison governor, the Minister of Justice, I would say right up the chain of command to the Prime Minister and Parliament, anyone who enables that death, either directly or indirectly, intentionally or unintentionally, those people who enable that are not above the law. And according to the UK law, there's four exceptions to the death in custody prosecutions. One of them is scary because if there is disorder or civil unrest in a prison and police operations for dealing with terrorism, civil unrest, or serious disorder in which the officers come under attack, they can't be prosecuted for death in custody or corporate manslaughter, which really should be corporate homicide. So, based on that exception to prosecuting for death in custody, if Belmarsh prison conditions deteriorate due to COVID, which they are, there's staff shortages, unhygienic sanitation, stink, increased isolation. Julian's in his cell for over 23 and a half hours a day. And there might be a shortage of personal protective equipment for the staff. Prisoners could get upset, riot, set fires, flood the cells, or clog the plumbing to protest the deteriorating conditions. If this causes a riot and there's a high-value detainee, such as Julian Assange, stuck in the middle of this serious disorder or chaos, the UK government is not liable for his death. So my fear is that Her Majesty's Prison Belmarsh will keep him behind bars in his isolation cell, despite the catastrophic, foreseeable, preventable death of Julian Assange. There's a spread of a killer virus, and the prisoners who aren't going to be released will probably be violent prisoners who have long convictions, and the anxiety is going to go up. The officers, the cleaning staff, the meal prep staff, it's an accident waiting to happen. It's a situation ready to blow up. So, it's possible and probable that if COVID doesn't kill Julian, then a prison riot could be by smoke inhalation, arson, violent prisoners freaking out. He calls for help. Nobody comes to help him. He's caught in the crossfires. Prison guards, prison officials can't intervene, and the prison authorities are exempt. So to keep him in jail, you got to ask yourself, is it reckless? For sure. Is it foreseeable? Yep. And does it amount to calculated homicide? That's murder with intent. And I would have to say yes. But Britain wants everyone to butt out of its corporate homicide, just like an abusive guy who tells the police to butt out so he can continue abusing his wife, son, daughter, elderly parent, and financially cripple that person. And pretty much Jeremy Hunt told the United Nations to butt out when the United Nations declared that he was arbitrarily detained. Britain basically said, this is none of your business, and said that to Neil Smeltzer as well. And they actually called that ruling ridiculous. So, if Assange dies, should the Ministry of Justice be held accountable for his death? Yes. No one's above the law. Boris Johnson, you are not above the law. And that's who the final decision rests with. So let's take a look at the actual law. And right in the law it says, was the gross breach of duty a cause of death of the prisoner who might die in custody and probably will die in custody? The prosecution must prove that the relevant breach of duty was a cause of death. It doesn't need to be the sole cause or even the main cause, so COVID, as long as it was an operating cause which made a more than minimal contribution to the death. Causation is established according to the principles of criminal law of homicide, so that's a whole other section. You can go to the Justice UK site or go to my article and click on the links I've got in this article. And then in the law it says particular care must be taken in cases of failure by omission. So it's not that somebody actively goes into his cell and chokes him, but they fail to provide effective medical treatment. So Julian's not getting psychiatric support, or a failure to protect the deceased, hopefully he's not deceased, from self-harm. This is key. The prosecution must prove that, but for the alleged gross breach of duty, the deceased would have survived, or at least that they would not have died at that time or in those circumstances. So what's the timing of everybody wanting Julian Assange to be released from Belmarsh out on bail, so he has access to his lawyers and he can fight a U.S. extradition? There is a contagion of a killer virus sweeping through Britain. People are dying left, right, and center. There's a shortage of personal protective equipment. Those are dire circumstances. So getting back to the law, quote, where the prosecution is relying on a series of failings. Okay, so there's a whole history of a series of failings. He shouldn't be in Belmarsh in the first place, but particularly in the jail. He shouldn't be in maximum security. He shouldn't have been in isolation. Visitors shouldn't have been restricted. Lawyers shouldn't have been restricted. His mail shouldn't have been withheld. All kinds of failings. Where the prosecution is relying on a series of failings over a period of time, the question of whether the deceased would have survived but for the gross breach of duty may require very careful analysis of the timeline to identify the time and the circumstances in which the gross breach was operative and whether intervention at that time would have avoided death. The intervention that his lawyers and the world is asking for is release on bail so that he can continue with his fight, 10-year fight, against extradition to the U.S. for being a publisher, journalist, intellect, researcher, and person of influence. The situation is grave. People have to rise up now so he doesn't die. Right now, there's no British law that's strong enough to really explain what's happening. This is beyond corporate manslaughter, although that's the only written law that I could find that has to do with death in custody. This is corporate homicide unfolding with intent, political assurances of impunity, all the way up to Boris Johnson and likely across the pond to Donald Trump in the U.S. It's a state-sanctioned murder any way you enact it. Interestingly enough, I also saw a photo shoot of President Moreno of Ecuador meeting at the White House for the first time in many, many years with his wife, having a photo op at the White House with Donald Trump and his wife. So bad behavior gets rewarded by Trump. So it's dark. The bottom line is this, and I wrote this in a previous blog. My intuition and research into the CIA and into CIA cover-ups has informed me that the US and the UK lawyers are at this moment emailing each other, having conversations about how to write drafts of a prefabricated British coroner's report. Because when somebody dies in custody, there's got to be a death certificate and a coroner's report. And that would be in the event that Assange dies in Belmarsh before the upcoming US extradition hearing. My question is, how can any medical doctor justify his negligence, torture as documented by Niels Meltzer, and the life-threatening exposure to COVID-19? They can't. So that will be left to the lawyers and the politicians to figure out pre and post-mortem. How are we going to record this? What are the talking points that we can say to the world if Assange dies today, tomorrow, next week? And not sarcastically, with a lot of truth, this is the way the media will report it. Assange, 48 years old, wearing a light knit blue jumper with matching socks and a loose-fitting khaki cargo pants, was found dead in his partially isolated messy cell this morning by prison guards. His hair was unbrushed, his teeth were unbrushed. There were no feces on the wall. During this time of public health emergency, an inquiry into his unfortunate death is not feasible. His body will be repatriated to Australia, where his family can mourn, but not have contact with his physical body, nor hold a funeral service due to COVID transmission threat and the need to socially distance. His body will likely be cremated and scattered across the ocean, just like Osama bin Laden. And I would add, his fiancée, Stella Morris, won't get to see him. Gabrielle won't get to see him. Baby Max won't get to see him because there's no visitors. His lawyers won't get to see him. His mom won't get to see him. His dad won't get to see him. And guess what? The public won't get to see him. My question is, what have you done to Julian Assange, Britain? If COVID spreads anywhere near Julian Assange, he will catch it and die very quickly. That's undeniable and that's certain. He's got a chronic lung condition, osteoporosis, psychological frailty, propensity towards suicide. So the UK government is not just tempting fate, but actively attempting to murder him. Britain will deny this. The States will deny it. It will appoint a coroner to write a post-mortem to the effect that Assange succumbed to COVID. Not the decade-long torture, the beating down of him as a human being, as an intellect. They won't mention the gross negligence or corruption all the way up to the Supreme Court. Today, in this moment, Julian Assange is a sitting duck. Apart from his family, apart from his kids, apart from his friends, his allies, he is disconnected from the internet. He's probably not getting nutritious food. God only knows what the air quality is like in Belmarsh. We don't even know what the heating is like. The States and Britain know this. And it's pretty obvious that he's probably too close to death to actually release him on humanitarian grounds. Why? Because we would see what Britain has done to him. And he actually might have a fighting chance of defending himself in the upcoming U.S. extradition case. The homicide is nearly there. There's a few more things that Britain could do to push him over the edge, like withhold life-sustaining psychotropic medications that treat his depression and stress disorder. And he quite literally could die of shock, which would be a heart attack, or he could have literally a nervous breakdown. This must stop. The UK is not above the law. Thank you for your participation in this, and there's so much more I could say.